On Monday, February 1st, 1960, at 4:30 in the afternoon, 4 young men entered the Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, and sat down at the lunch counter and asked for a cup of coffee. They were refused service because they were black. Blacks had to use the stand-up counter at the end and the back of the store. They stayed in their seats as a crowd gathered around them, insulting them, throwing things at them. The police were called. The crowd gathered outside. The young men received death threats from folks in the crowd, but they stayed in their seats. The next day, 27 students from the local college, the North Carolina Ag and Tech College, showed up at Woolworths, sat down at the lunch counter, and were refused service. On Wednesday, 80 students showed up. By the end of the week, there were some 600 students spilling out into the street protesting the segregation laws in North Carolina. The movement the following week spread from Greensboro to Winston-Salem, and then throughout the South to Atlanta, and all the way by the end of the month to Texas, some 70,000 students protesting segregation laws throughout the South. Malcolm Gladwell writes about this in an article in the New Yorker to highlight what he calls the difference between strong ties and weak ties. He writes with a fair amount of skepticism about some of the claims made about social media's power to organize social movements, social media like Facebook and Twitter. And certainly he says they're good modes of communication, but he doubts that, he doubts that they have the impact on social change that the sorts of strong ties that those students in the 60s had with one another. The 4 original young men were, 2 of them were roommates on one floor of a dormitory building, and 2 were roommates on another floor. 3 of them had known each other in high school. They had hung out on many Saturday afternoons during that first year of college, drinking beer, playing cards, and talking about what was wrong with the world and what they might do about it. And finally, they sort of goaded each other into taking the action that they took. In addition, they were members of the student chapter of the NAACP. They had been trained in nonviolent protest. It had been drilled into them how important it was not to lash out when they were attacked, not to insult the people who were insulting them, not to respond to violence with violence, not to respond to hatred with hate. If they had done that, the moral authority of their movement would have been wiped out. They'd have lost their biggest weapon. In addition, the students who followed them had received that kind of training as well. These kinds of strong ties, Gladwell writes, are what results in social change. It's what started the civil rights movement off in earnest in the 60s that led to the changes in laws that led to real change in our society. I report all this not to bash Facebook or social media, but because I think it gives us an insight into what's going on in this morning's Gospel from John. This is the 3rd appearance of Jesus to his disciples after the resurrection. We heard about the first 2 last week. You remember that on that first Easter Sunday, the disciples are gathered in the upper room for a meal. They are confused, they are frightened, they've heard the stories about the empty tomb, but they don't know what it means, they don't know what to make of it. They're trying to figure out what their next steps are going to be. And Jesus somehow all of a sudden appears in their midst. He says, "Peace be with you." He breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit," as a means of, I think, saying to the disciples, I'm not going to be with you physically any longer. You're going to have to figure out how to get through this life, but you are going to be supported and surrounded, protected and comforted by the Holy Spirit. You will not be left alone. I won't be here with you, but you will still have God surrounding you, protecting you, supporting you in this life. You remember that Thomas wasn't with them at that first meeting. He refuses to believe anything that he hears from the disciples. So a week later, the disciples, this time with Thomas, are gathered again in the upper room, and Jesus again appears to them. He shows Thomas the scars on his hands and on his feet, and Thomas believes. Jesus says to Thomas, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. I think as a means of saying to both the disciples and to us all of these years later, that hundreds and thousands and millions of people will have to come to faith without actually having had an experience of Jesus in the flesh. The disciples are going to have to figure out how to convey the experience that they have had to folks who will never have that experience. And then, in the story that we just heard this morning, the disciples have left Jerusalem, they've gone back to their home in Galilee, and Peter says, I'm going fishing. Now this is not like you and me deciding to go fishing just to blow off steam to relax in the afternoon. This is what Peter and the disciples did for a living before Jesus came along and told them to follow him. I think Peter is saying, look, I don't know what to make of everything that's happened. I don't really know what we're supposed to be doing. Maybe it's time for us just to get back to life as usual. The disciples go out in the boat. They don't catch anything. It's not unusual for a fisherman not to catch anything. It's the luck of the draw. As they're coming back to shore, someone from the shore calls out and tells them to cast their nets out on the other side of the boat, and when they do, it's filled with fish. And somehow, in that interaction with the stranger on the shore, they realize that it is Jesus. It is the risen Lord once again appearing to them. They go to the beach, they share a meal with Jesus, and Jesus says to Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" I think as a way of reversing, perhaps, Peter's denial of Jesus. You remember that at the Last Supper, Jesus tells Peter that he will deny him 3 times. Peter proclaims that he would never deny Jesus, but sure enough, that evening leading into Good Friday, Peter does deny knowing Jesus 3 times. And so Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" And 3 times Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And Jesus says to him, "Feed my sheep, tend my flock, feed my lambs." Into this interaction between Jesus, Peter, and the disciples, somehow the disciples are jolted back out of trying to get back to life as usual. They go back to Jerusalem, and they begin to share with the people there, the people that they meet there, what their experience of the living Christ was like. What traveling around with Jesus all those years was like. What Jesus taught them. How Jesus acted, how Jesus treated people he came into contact with. They tell people about Jesus eating with the folks considered unclean in society. About Jesus treating women with dignity and respect in a time when that was absolutely unheard of. About Jesus reaching out to those on the margins, those who were cast out of society, and bringing them into the center, bringing them to the table, treating everyone with dignity and respect. And through these relationships, through these one-on-one relationships, through these strong ties, the movement that Jesus started spreads, first in Jerusalem, then throughout Israel, then across the northern Mediterranean, and eventually around the world. You may know I spend time working with clergy and lay leaders in the College for Congregational Development. Folks show up for our weekend programs, for our week-long program in the summer, and they want that magic bullet for their church. They want to know what they can tweak on their website that will get people in the door, whether maybe there's something they could do with signage, if there's some way they could be more present on Facebook. They want that easy fix. And we listen to them, and then we start asking questions. We ask them, how do they remember that they first came to their church? We ask them how it was that they first came to faith. How it was that they first learned about God, how it was they first learned about Jesus. And over the course of our time together, they realized that it wasn't a sign, it wasn't a website, it wasn't a Facebook post. It was someone that they trusted, someone that they knew, who told them about God, who told them about their experience with Jesus, who told them about their church, who maybe invited them to join them at church. was these strong ties that brought people to faith. Jesus says to Peter 2,000 years ago, and he says to us today, to feed the sheep. The invitation that Jesus makes to us, I think, is to share out in how it was that we came to a relationship with the risen Christ, how we came to faith. We can share that in words. As Episcopalians, we tend not to be so comfortable with that. We can share that in the way that we live our life. We can share that by example. And in this way, we can continue to tend the flock, to feed the sheep, to follow in the path that God would have us follow. I pray this week that you will spend some time reflecting on how you came to faith and how that you might live your life in such a way that you might invite others to join you on that path. Amen.